May I join you? Cheryl asked. Ileana cast a glance through the window to find Magnus, who sat leisurely on his throne. She told Cheryl to do as she wished. She thanked Ileana and then cheerfully offered Ileana more champagne as she joined her near the banister. She pulled out bottles of wine as well as wine glasses from beneath her coat. She made a show of pouring wine and Ileana was horrified at her actions. Cheryl drank the wine, displaying her impressive drinking talent that left Ileana stupefied. Was the female lead always such a good drinker? Cheryl was overly friendly as she asked Ileana about her favorite foods. She'd bring some over, but Ileana dismissively said that there's no need for that. Cheryl's eyes twinkled as she watched Ileana drink her wine, impressed by how well Ileana held her liquor. What house was she from? She introduced herself as Ileana from the Glane house and Cheryl said curiously, so you're Marquis Glane's daughter. How did she know Marquis Glane? Cheryl explained that she didn't know him personally, but he'd stood out amongst the many ministers when she was introduced as the new Mendez because he'd treated her differently from the rest. He hadn't treated her like a commoner but like the new Mendez as her title suggested. But it wasn't respect though, Cheryl thought to herself. It was more like her existence was of little importance to him. Ileana told her that she'd been a priest in training for the past 2 years when Cheryl mentioned not seeing her at any banquets. Cheryl was surprised. Why would a noble train to become a priest? That meant leaving behind all power and privilege. Cheryl looked at Ileana in awe. Why couldn't the rest of nobility be as humble as Lady Ileana? She'd shouted out. High-ranking nobles were afraid of losing power, so they cozied up to Cheryl just because she had a title and some power. But the only reason for this was because she had His Majesty's favor. She mischievously said they should do the same since they think His Majesty gives power while playing favorites. But Ileana told her that it was only natural to want to present themselves to His Majesty in a good light. She drew closer to Ileana as she told her that Ileana was different. She grabbed Ileana's hand. Since they got along so well, they should attend these tiresome banquets together from this point on. Ileana yanked her hand away. I must refuse, she told Cheryl arrogantly. She must have mistaken Ileana for a humble person. She was still nobility and Cheryl was but a commoner. A fact which couldn't be changed, but Cheryl only smiled. She'd, however, taken a liking to Ileana and she knew they would meet again. She spoke with certainty as she gazed at Ileana with a confident smile. Cheryl was curious if Ileana felt the same way, but before she could reply, a deep voice called Cheryl's name out from behind her. It was the voice she'd been dreading but had also longed for. She visibly stiffened and she didn't dare turn around. Magnus leaned against the doorframe as he looked at them. Cheryl smiled slyly because she'd noticed the tension in Ileana's face. It was only for a second, but she'd noticed, nonetheless. Cheryl had been gone for a while so Magnus came looking for her, he said in an almost bored tone. She apologized as she walked to Magnus, and told him it was because she'd been having such a pleasant conversation with the lady that she'd lost track of time. She turned and introduced Ileana who still hadn't turned around. She flinched as she felt his gaze on her. She let out a breath and then forced herself to face him as she bowed low. I am Ileana Glane, Your Majesty. She kept her head low as he responded. She was the only child of Marquis Glane. She apologized as she hadn't greeted him yet, she explained, her head still facing down. She hadn't seen his expression. He gazed at her with almost a luminous golden eyes, jaw clenched as he restrained himself. But of course, Cheryl, who'd been standing off to the side as they'd exchanged words, had noticed his reaction to Ileana. She grinned in excitement as if waiting for Magnus to pounce on Ileana at any moment. As if he'd wanted to swallow her whole. But much to her disappointment, he smirked and turned to walk away. If she's done, they were to head inside, he told Cheryl. Cheryl was confused at his abrupt change in behavior. Why did he not take the lady as he'd said he'd always wanted? Was he okay? She grabbed his arm in concern and he looked at her with almost deranged wildness on his face. She nervously let him go and gave a quick farewell to Ileana who still stood in the same position. As they walked across the ballroom floor, Cheryl was concerned about the way they'd left the lady with her head still bent. Was it okay to leave like that? Magnus smiled a carefree smile, back to his usual self as he asked if she was concerned about Ileana. She kept quiet as she thought about Ileana Glane. She'd had the air of a monarch, but it was different from Magnus. She had the ability to create a relaxed atmosphere. She sheepishly told Magnus that Ileana Glane hadn't seemed like a bad person. She'd also been completing priest training these past 2 years. Magnus stopped suddenly at her words, and she bumped into his motionless body. Ileana believed in God, she told Magnus. But soon that God would be destroyed, Magnus said as he let loose an uncontrollable grin. Cheryl, concerned by his words, asked him not to destroy the temple because he still needed to stabilize his position. She said the most ridiculous things sometimes, he said as he smiled at her, and she thought about how boyish and innocent he looked. What had made him become so cruel? Magnus smiled surely as he told Cheryl that the only god Ileana will come to know and trust will be him, because the only god a beast can trust is its master. He walked up the steps to his throne. But how was he to tame a clever fox? He asked contemplatively. He looked at Cheryl as he lounged against his seat. What should he do to make her walk obediently into his arms? Ileana rose as she let out a breath she'd been holding. She felt as if her heart might have given out at any moment. She furiously let her annoyance out. Why did he have to come out while she had a conversation with Cheryl? She walked on unsteady legs to the edge of the balcony, holding her chest, her heartbeat still erratic. She'd felt apologetic to Cheryl for having behaved that way. She cringed as she remembered how she'd slapped Cheryl's hand away. But she couldn't control her behavior because that's something the original Ileana would have done. But why was the story so different? In the original story, Ileana never encountered the female lead like this. But then again, if this followed the original storyline, Cheryl would have been crowned empress already. She leaned onto the banister as she thought about her earlier emotions. She'd definitely tried her best to avoid eye contact with Magnus, but her body wouldn't let her. Was Ileana's emotions so powerful that she'd lost control of her body? It seemed that deep within that body, there laid a dormant desire so dark, it claimed Magnus as its own. An unimaginable possessiveness and a jealousy so frightening, it all seemed to stem from the original Ileana's feelings. She wrapped her fingers around her neck and bit her lip as anxiety welled up inside of her. As she'd listened to Magnus' voice as he'd spoken to Cheryl, she'd felt glad, but her emotions had sat side by side with the original Ileana's emotions. She headed inside intending to leave. She'd had enough of this precarious evening. She was certain those feelings were not hers. She couldn't have fallen in love with Magnus after only a few days spent together. She rushed out of the building, each step fueled by her anger. Just how much longer must she continue to suffer from Ileana's dark and twisted emotions? As she made her way along the pathway, she thought about Ileana's feelings for Magnus. How had she hidden such feelings away behind a mask of indifference? She'd felt only a glimmer of it, and it had overwhelmed her so much, her body had almost vibrated with the tension as she tried to control it. She stopped by a fountain and looked down as her reflection stared back at her. Had Ileana endured such emotions all her life? Just then, distant shouting pulled Ileana from her thoughts and she looked up to see a young boy running from a covering of trees. But he hadn't shown any sign of slowing down and Ileana realized she should have moved, but it was too late. He stumbled into her and took her down with him into the fountain. They both groaned in pain. Ileana asked him if he was okay, but he hadn't any time to answer because faint shouting interrupted them. He got up and with a quick apology to Ileana, he was gone again. But what was a child doing running around the palace at this time of night? Based on his clothes, he hadn't seemed like a servant. A theory struck her. Perhaps that was the royal family's hidden child? An heir who threatened Magnus' position? But she sighed at the ridiculousness of it all. It was none of her business because she had her own problems to deal with. She decided to head back to the Spring Moon Palace. Back at the palace, she plopped down on her bed, exhausted with the day's events. She'd much rather have to deal with her father than what she went through today. When they'd locked eyes, she'd felt like the original Ileana instead of herself. She couldn't tell the difference between the two because her emotions were so out of control. She lay in a fetal position and clenched her fist. Tears gathered in her eyes. How she desperately wanted to go back home. Her small studio apartment wasn't much, and life was difficult there, but at least she was responsible for her own emotions. At least she was certain her emotions were hers. She would always feel like a stranger in this body and in this world. Morning came and Ileana had a new crisis on her hands. She stared in the mirror with a horrified expression. She needed to attend another banquet, but what was this pufferfish looking back at her? Noble ladies sat in the garden, mindless chatter floated in the air. But where was Lady Glane, one lady asked. She hadn't attended any tea parties, but she'd fallen ill. Their commentary turned malicious as they spoke about her training for priesthood 2 years prior. Her god didn't care for her much, they all laughed. She might have caught an infectious disease since she'd stayed with lowly commoners, one said as they mocked her. While Ileana laid, resting on a sofa near the window, she felt a prickling sense that somewhere, someone laughed at her expense. She laid with a wet cloth over her eyes. Once removed, it revealed puffy eyes, swollen and red. She couldn't leave her room for this reason. If anyone saw her in this state, rumors about her were bound to get worse. A knock on the door revealed a messenger and he told her that some ladies have requested a visit. Ileana vehemently wanted to refuse, but she kept her indifferent tone as she told him to relay that she wasn't seriously ill so they shouldn't bother with a visit. He informed her that one of the ladies was the daughter of a duke and for a lady, who was a daughter of a marquis, to turn away a lady of such standing was preposterous. She stopped her action of pouring tea and looked at the messenger with an almost mad look in her eyes. Was he patronizing her? He bowed deeply and nervously apologized because he'd heard about the infamous Ileana Glane and her vicious temper. He would do as she ordered and left the room as fast as his feet would carry him. Even in her room, they seemed to want to bother her. She decided to leave her private space and head out. She gazed at the statue in fascination. She hadn't expected to see such a large statue of R'jabbar on the imperial grounds. Was there a temple nearby? She was proven right as she glanced behind the statue to find the entrance. Although it was minor compared to other temples, it was quite beautiful. She decided to take a look around the temple and if she had spare time, she'd offer a prayer as well. Ileana smiled as she thought about her prayers during her priest training. She would sit in front of a R'jabbar statue and curse and vent out her anger at the author under the guise of praying to the god R'jabbar. She found it all so amusing now. As she made her way to the temple, a voice stopped her. He was a priest and she told him that she'd seen the R'jabbar statue and came out of curiosity. He scoffed at her, seemingly another noble lady who wanted to satisfy their curiosity. This wasn't a place for a non-believer and he asked her to leave. She explained that she would like to pray in peace and pulled out her pledge, testament to her faith. He was surprised a noble lady would have such a thing and then realization dawned on him. Are you the lady of House Glane? He asked. He'd of course heard of the noble lady that had studied at the temple for 2 years. When she confirmed that she was, indeed, Lady Ileana Glane, he bowed and offered her an apology, his attitude completely different from his earlier rude behavior. He introduced himself as Julio, the caretaker of this temple. He told her to follow him, now allowing her entry. As he led her through the temple's corridor, he explained that the temple was built as a bargain between the late emperor and the church, but it was the new Emperor Magnus de Cloud that had given them more leeway under his reign. Their duties to the empire was to prepare for services that happen in the capital, which was why there was no communal prayer room. But this temple was not open to the public. She said sadly. How unfortunate that was, but he turned to her and cheerfully told her he'd happily lend her his own private praying room. She smiled and thanked him. He was glad that she looked for God through prayer. She trotted behind him, satisfied that word had spread so well that she was extremely religious. It had been hard to keep up the facade in Khotan, but she was glad it had paid off. She shivered as she thought about all that she'd witnessed in Khotan. The murder and those dangerous hooded men. She questioned Reverend Julio if he were a high priest, and when he'd responded yes, she hesitantly asked if he could answer a question she'd been curious about. By any chance, do you know anything about the Book of Prophecy? He didn't turn, his body stock still at her words. Why do you ask about such a blasphemous superstition? He asked her, his jovial voice from earlier, gone. She'd noticed his change in demeanor and nervously told him about people she'd met in Khotan who believed in this superstition. She'd wanted to rebuke them for their foolish beliefs, but she couldn't because she didn't know much about the superstition as well. She'd wished to know more about it so that she could spread word about their faith better to counter such evil created by humans. She'd surprised herself with an ability to tell such eloquent lies. She needed to find out more about it because there were too many strange details that weren't mentioned in the novel. Ileana's journal, her bruises, and the Book of Prophecy. The fact that she searched but couldn't find any information about it made it all the more frustrating. Priest Julio seemed quite reluctant to talk about this, which meant not just anyone could get information on this. But because he was a high priest, he was in a position to know more about it than others. He finally turned and smiled unexpectedly bright. He understood now that her question has come from a place of her faith, and he'd answer it the best he could, within boundaries of course. There was certain things that even he as a high priest couldn't discuss. Black Book or Black Letters, both referred to the forbidden prophecy. It was a prophecy that first appeared in the empire's founding myth. The myth relates to the first emperor Cloud I, who received aid from the four kings, a conquest of war. The emperor then held a banquet to mark the founding of the empire, and it was at this banquet that each king offered a relic to the emperor. The first king offered a gold necklace, the second king an embalmed leather sheath, the third king a sword covered in myrrh, and the fourth king a silver key encrusted with precious gems. Ileana recalled all this after having read a book about the myth of the empire's founding in Khotan. The banquet was held for 3 days, and on the last day the emperor received one last gift. A mysterious, cloaked guest arrived and condemned the emperor for a war he'd started just to create the empire. The amount of blood shed and lives that were lost to build this empire would be the undoing of this very land they walked. The guest told him of a book that told of the future of this empire. He was to read it to avoid its imminent destruction, but the emperor hadn't read the book. Because it was humans that had founded this empire, it would be humans who decides its fate. The emperor had then used the relics to seal the book away, Priest Julio explained. That was the myth that everyone knew, but why did the Book of Prophecy become a symbol of evil? Ileana inquired curiously. He walked up the steps as she trailed behind, he explained. A group of people appeared and claimed that they saw the words inscribed in the prophecy. They then possessed people using a strange power, almost as if they'd acquired it from the devil. People were then conditioned to manifest animal-like behavior. They would also manipulate people into never waking up from their dreams. The chaos led to a riot, and eventually the church stepped in. They minimized the existence of the Book of Prophecy to that of a fable in hopes that no one would fall prey to those delusions again. Ileana feigned dismay as she thought about his words. They settled the riot by convincing the masses that everything was just heresy, she thought dubiously. But what about that strange power? Ileana thanked him as he'd led her to the praying room. He was about to leave, but she stopped him, and she clasped her hands as she asked if he knew where the forbidden Book of Prophecy had been sealed. A dark look crossed his face before he answered. There were many theories, but the exact location was never found. But it didn't matter because they only needed to believe in one thing alone, and that was God. Rejabar, he praised. His eyes took on a dangerous glint as he gazed at her. It was better to offer prayer to God than to waste time on a worthless search. Ileana noticed the look on his face and cheerfully played off his suspicion as she said that she'd only asked out of curiosity. He scared Ileana with an abrupt smile and left her to her time to pray. Alone in the praying room, she thought about all that she'd heard. The founding myth, the prophecy, and people with strange abilities. How much of it was actually useful? What was the link between each case? She stared at the Rejabar statue. Was the incident in Khotan just a coincidence? But how was the original Ileana connected to all of this? Nobility gasped and whispered much like the first day when they caught sight of her at the banquet. She'd had no choice but to attend since it's the last day, they said. They chattered about her family and the fact that the Glane family had no other close relatives, so she'd most likely be the next heir. Ileana, as usual, kept her calm facade fixed in place. She'd heard it all before, so it didn't bother her. What had surprised her though was the sight of Marquis Glane. Not only she but everyone was surprised by his presence. "Father," she greeted. Unlike before, all gossip died down at the appearance of Marquis Glane. She felt relieved that she was no longer the center of attention. He took her hand and escorted Ileana to a more secluded spot. Ileana was proud that her father had brought with him a quietness to the ballroom. She smirked because of the fearful atmosphere his presence brought about. But then again, his presence did the same to her. She wanted to know if the Marquis had any merchant businesses. He chuckled, surprised Ileana would ask something like this. She wanted to learn more about his businesses after the banquet, she explained. He halted in his steps and glared at her. But why did he look at her so? All she wanted to know was if she could get separate funding. He told her it must be true that she'd lost her memories since she'd taken an interest in something she'd hated before. It was almost as if she'd become a completely different person. She flinched at his words, and she let go of his hand. She'd changed her mind, she answered simply. He looked at her, but what caught his eye was the choker necklace she wore. Attached to it was a cross. She received it as a present from the high priest, she explained. Reverend Julio had given to her a pendant that symbolized the goddess. It had a weak blessing cast on it. But why would he give her something so precious? He told her vaguely that she might need it more than him. Marquis Glane gazed at her and called her name, but he was interrupted by an announcement. His Majesty Emperor Magnus is entering. He walked in with Cheryl by his side. As they passed, Ileana's heart throbbed painfully. In the original story, Magnus recognized Ileana and detained her on the last day of the banquet, and Ileana had just accepted her fate. She tried her best to avoid such a future for herself. Had she done it? Had she avoided her death flag? Magnus spoke up. This banquet was held with the intention of selecting an empress. And on the first day he'd already set his sights on her. Everyone was curious, which family did she belong to? Ileana clasped her hands together and prayed the hardest she'd ever prayed before. Please let Magnus choose Cheryl. Please let the banquet end without any issues. Magnus stood up and told everyone that because he'd be announcing such an important figure such as Empress, he needed to abide by formality and courtesy. He snapped his fingers and the royal knights filed into the room. What was happening? People gasped in alarm, but Magnus was amused by it all. There was no need to be anxious as this was just a formality to greet the new Empress. He walked down the steps as the knights formed a bridge, connecting him to none other than Ileana. This is a joyous day, almost like fate, he said as he walked. It's blind and unique. An affection that holds my life within its grasp just like the affection a tamed beast holds for its master. He stopped a breath away from her and gazed at her with satisfaction in his eyes. He softly said her name that he'd always known her as. Lina. She shuddered as her name floated from his lips. She couldn't look up. Fear rooted her to the spot. He bent and spoke softly, only for her to hear. I became a human just as you'd wished. Now it's your turn. He smiled and lightly brushed away the hair from her face. With that he spoke loudly for everyone to hear. He told her, Ileana Glane, I want you to be my empress.